Here's a strange fact to start with. Since humans first learned to dig it out of the ground, we have mined roughly 244,000 tons of gold in our entire history. That's the estimate most geologists agree on. And here's the strange part. Almost all of it still exists. Unlike oil, which we burn, or wood, which we build with and eventually lose to rot and fire, gold doesn't disappear. The ring on your finger might contain atoms that were once part of a Roman coin, or an Egyptian pharaoh's death mask, or a Spanish galleon's cargo hauled up from the seafloor centuries later. Every ounce ever mined is in some form probably still out there. And yet, gold does almost nothing useful. You can't eat it, you can't burn it for fuel, it's too soft to build a sword or a plow. For most of human history, its only real properties were that it shines, it doesn't tarnish, and there isn't very much of it. That's it. That's the whole resume. And on the strength of that resume, gold has toppled empires, financed wars, enslaved millions, and still, right now, today, sits in vaults beneath the streets of New York and London as the backstop of the entire global financial system. This is the story of how a soft, shiny, mostly useless metal convinced the entire human species that it was worth killing for. It's a story of ancient kings and conquistadors, of gold rushes and gold standards, of a false Hajj that crashed an economy and a president who broke a 5,000-year-old promise in a single television address. Gold didn't just become money, it became one of the most consequential ideas humanity ever agreed to believe in. Gold's story doesn't begin with humans. It begins about 4.6 billion years ago in the violent death of stars. Specifically, scientists now believe, in the collision of neutron stars, an event so cataclysmic it forges heavy elements, like gold, in a matter of seconds. That stardust eventually became part of the material that formed Earth, and because gold is dense, most of it sank toward the planet's molten core when the Earth was young. The gold we actually find near the surface today arrived later, delivered by asteroid impacts during a period geologists call the Late Veneer, roughly 4 billion years ago. Fast forward to humans, and the earliest evidence we have of people collecting gold comes from the Varna necropolis in modern-day Bulgaria, a burial site dated to around 4600 BCE, that's over 6,600 years ago. Archaeologists excavating it in the 1970s found more than 3,000 gold objects, including what's believed to be the oldest processed gold jewelry ever discovered. Whoever these people were, they had already decided gold was special enough to bury with their dead. But the civilization that really turned gold into a cultural obsession was ancient Egypt. The Egyptians controlled access to gold-rich regions in Nubia to the south, and the very name Nubia is thought by some scholars to derive from Nub, the ancient Egyptian word for gold. Egyptian pharaohs didn't just wear gold, they believed it was literally the flesh of the gods, specifically the sun god Ra, which is why tombs like Tutankhamun's, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, were packed with gold death masks, coffins, and jewelry meant to carry the pharaoh into eternity. By around 1500 BCE, Egypt was one of the wealthiest gold-producing regions on Earth, and that wealth flowed outward through trade and tribute across the ancient Near East, making gold a status symbol from the Nile to Mesopotamia to the Aegean. What's important here is that gold hasn't become money yet. It was sacred, it was decorative, it was a symbol of divine power. The leap from gold is beautiful and rare to gold is currency was still centuries away, and it would happen not in Egypt but in a small kingdom on the coast of modern-day Turkey. Around 600 BCE, in the kingdom of Lydia, on the western edge of what's now Turkey, something happened that changed the entire trajectory of human economics. The Lydians began minting standardized coins out of electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver that washed down from the nearby Pactolus River. These weren't just lumps of precious metal anymore. They were stamped with official marks guaranteeing their weight and purity, issued by the state. Historians generally credit Lydia, and specifically the innovation refined under King Elaeatus and later his son, as the birthplace of true coinage. That son was Croesus, who took the throne around 560 BCE and became so fabulously wealthy that his name is still used today, rich as Croesus, as shorthand for extreme wealth. Croesus refined the Lydian coinage system further, separating gold and silver coins instead of using the electrum blend, which made their value far easier to standardize and trust. This mattered enormously because trust is the entire foundation of money. A coin is worthless unless everyone agrees to believe in its value, and Croesus effectively industrialized that belief. The idea spread fast. The Persian Empire, after conquering Lydia in 546 BCE, adopted and expanded the system, and under Darius the Great, around 515 BCE, the Persians introduced the gold daric, a coin that would circulate across an empire stretching from Egypt to the Indus Valley. Meanwhile, Greek city-states developed their own coinage traditions, and by the time Alexander the Great was conquering the known world in the 4th century BCE, gold coins stamped with his image were functioning as a kind of ancient international currency, accepted from Macedonia to Babylon to the edges of India. Rome inherited and scaled this idea to an entirely new level. The Roman aureus, a gold coin introduced under Julius Caesar and standardized under Augustus, became the backbone of one of the largest economies the ancient world had ever seen. Roman gold came from conquered territories. Spain's Las Medulas mines alone are estimated to have produced enormous quantities of gold using a brutal hydraulic mining technique that literally blasted mountainsides apart with water. What had started as sacred ornamentation in Egypt had within a few centuries become the operating system of the empire. While Rome was minting aurii in the West, an entirely separate gold economy was thriving in West Africa, one that would eventually produce one of the wealthiest individuals in recorded human history. Beginning around the 8th century CE, the empires of Ghana and later Mali controlled access to gold fields in the regions of Bambouk, Bure, and later Akan in what's now Ghana, Mali, and surrounding countries. This gold moved north across the Sahara Desert via camel caravan routes to cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and eventually to the Mediterranean trading centers in exchange for salt, a commodity so valuable in the region that gold and salt were, for a time, traded roughly ounce for ounce. This trans-Saharan gold trade is estimated to have supplied a significant share of the gold circulating in medieval Europe and the Islamic world for several centuries. The empire that came to control this trade most spectacularly was Mali, and its most famous ruler was Mansa Musa, who took the throne around 1312. In 1324, Mansa Musa undertook the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, and he did it with a caravan historians describe as staggering. Estimates vary, but accounts describe thousands of soldiers, attendants, and slaves, along with dozens of camels carrying hundreds of pounds of gold each. When his procession passed through Cairo, Mansa Musa gave away so much gold that he single-handedly caused gold's value in Egypt to crash, with some accounts suggesting local gold prices took over a decade to recover. A 14th century Catalan atlas, one of the most important maps of the medieval world, depicts Mansa Musa sitting on a throne holding a giant gold nugget, a visual signal to European mapmakers that somewhere south of the Sahara sat almost unimaginable wealth. This is the moment gold stops being a purely regional story and becomes a global one. European powers, hearing rumors of West African gold, began to dream of finding a sea route directly to its source, bypassing the Muslim-controlled trans-Saharan gold trade routes entirely. That ambition would help Portuguese exploration down the African coast in the 15th century under sponsors like Prince Henry the Navigator, and it's not a coincidence that the stretch of West African coastline the Portuguese reached in the 1470s became known quite literally as the Gold Coast. The hunger for gold was now a geopolitical force, reshaping trade routes and setting the stage for the age of European exploration, an age that would soon collide, catastrophically, with civilizations on the other side of the Atlantic. If there is a single darkest chapter in gold's biography, it's this one. When Spanish explorers arrived in the Americas at the end of the 15th century, they encountered civilizations, the Aztec and Inca empires chief among them, that possessed enormous quantities of worked gold, used ceremonially and decoratively in ways that echoed ancient Egypt more than they resembled European coinage. The Spanish did not see art or sacred tradition, they saw plunder. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico with a small force and, through a combination of alliances with rival indigenous groups, disease, and brutal violence, brought down the Aztec Empire by 1521, seizing the capital city of Tenochtitlan and its accumulated gold. But the single most infamous episode came a decade later in Peru. In November 1532, Francisco Pizarro's forces captured the Inca emperor Atahualpa at Cajamarca. Atahualpa, hoping to secure his release, offered to fill a room, historical accounts describe it as roughly 22 feet by 17 feet, once with gold as high as he could reach, and twice more with silver. Over the following months, gold and silver objects poured in from across the empire to meet the ransom. Pizarro accepted the treasure, and then, in July 1533, he had Atahualpa executed anyway. What followed was the systematic dismantling of the Inca Empire and the extraction of its wealth on an industrial scale. The Spanish crown established the encomienda system and later intensified forced labor through the mita, a colonial adaptation of an Inca labor tradition, compelling indigenous communities to work in mines under brutal conditions. While the mountain of Potosi, discovered in 1545, is most famous for silver rather than gold, the same forced labor machinery extracted gold across the Spanish colonies for roughly 3 centuries. Historians estimate that the population of indigenous peoples in the Americas collapsed by a staggering margin in the century following contact, driven primarily by European diseases like smallpox, to which Native Americans had no immunity, but compounded by the violence, displacement, and forced labor of colonial extraction. The gold and silver that flowed back to Spain, carried across the Atlantic in treasure fleets, some of which were sunk by storms or captured by pirates and rival European powers, didn't just enrich the Spanish crown. It triggered a phenomenon economists now call the price revolution, a sustained and dramatic inflation across 16th century Europe as the sudden influx of American gold and silver diluted the value of currency. Gold, the metal that had once symbolized divine order in Egyptian tombs, had become the engine of a genocide-adjacent colonial economy and the first true experience humanity had with a metal-driven global economic shock. Nearly 3 centuries after Pizarro, gold triggered another kind of upheaval. Faster, more chaotic, and driven not by empires, but by ordinary people gripped by fever. On January 24, 1848, a carpenter named James W. Marshall discovered flakes of gold in the tail race of a sawmill he was building for John Sutter near Coloma, California. Word spread slowly at first, then explosively once President James K. Polk confirmed the discovery in a message to Congress in December 1848. What followed was the California Gold Rush, one of the largest mass migrations in American history. An estimated 300,000 people, later nicknamed 49ers for the year 1849, poured into California from across the United States and around the world, including significant numbers from China, Latin America, and Europe. The human cost was severe and often erased from the celebratory mythology of the gold rush. California's indigenous population, estimated at around 150,000 people in 1848, is believed to have fallen to roughly 30,000 by 1870 through a combination of disease, starvation, displacement, and outright violence, including state-sanctioned militia campaigns against Native communities that some modern historians classify as genocide. Chinese immigrant miners faced systematic discrimination, including a foreign miners' tax enacted in 1850 that disproportionately targeted them. Environmentally, the shift from simple panning to hydraulic mining, which used high-pressure water cannons to blast entire hillsides apart, devastated California's landscape and rivers so severely that it triggered one of the first major environmental lawsuits in American history, the 1884 Woodruff v. North Bloomfield Mining Company, which effectively banned the practice. Similar fevers erupted elsewhere. Gold was discovered in Australia in 1851 near Bathurst, New South Wales, triggering a rush that dramatically boosted the colony's population and economy. Then, in 1886, an Australian prospector named George Harrison found gold on a farm called Langlukti in what's now South Africa, kicking off the discovery of the Witwatersrand, still, by many estimates, the largest gold-bearing geological formation ever found, having produced somewhere around 40% of all the gold ever mined by humans. The city of Johannesburg grew up almost overnight around it. But Witwatersrand gold sat deep underground, requiring industrial-scale mining rather than individual panning, and the labor system that emerged to extract it, reliant heavily on Black South African migrant workers housed in single-sex compounds under harsh, exploitative conditions, became a foundational piece of the racial and economic architecture that would later harden into apartheid in 1948. Gold, once again, had built extraordinary wealth on the back of extraordinary human exploitation. As gold mining industrialized, so did gold's relationship with money itself. For most of history, coins were gold. The metal and the currency were the same physical object. But by the 19th century, nations increasingly began issuing paper money backed by promises, a government note that could, in theory, be exchanged for a fixed amount of actual gold held in a vault. This system, known as the gold standard, gave paper currency stability and international credibility because everyone trusted that behind the paper sat something real and finite. Britain formally adopted the gold standard in 1821, and much of the industrialized world followed over the following decades, creating a loosely unified international monetary system by the late 19th century. Mining itself was transformed by chemistry during this period too. The MacArthur Forest process, patented in 1887 by Scottish chemists John Stuart MacArthur and the Forest brothers, used cyanide to efficiently extract gold from low-grade ore, making previously unprofitable deposits, including much of the deep Witwatersrand Reef, commercially viable. Gold extraction went from pickaxes and pans to industrial chemical plants within a single generation. But the gold standard proved fragile under the pressure of the 20th century's catastrophes. World War I forced most European nations to suspend gold convertibility to finance the war, and though some countries, including Britain, briefly returned to the gold standard in the 1920s, the Great Depression shattered it for good in most of the world by the early 1930s. In the United States, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102 in April 1933, which controversially required most Americans to sell their private gold holdings to the government at a fixed price. And in 1934, the Gold Reserve Act raised the official price of gold and centralized much of the nation's holdings, famously depositing large reserves in a newly built vault at Fort Knox, Kentucky, completed in 1937. The final attempt to formalize gold's role came at the Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944, where representatives of 44 Allied nations meeting in New Hampshire near the end of World War II established a new international monetary system. Under Bretton Woods, the U.S. dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and other currencies were pegged to the dollar, effectively making the dollar the world's reserve currency, backed indirectly by American gold reserves. For nearly 3 decades, this system anchored global finance, until it too began to buckle. By the late 1960s, the Bretton Woods system was under enormous strain. The United States was running persistent trade deficits and spending heavily on the Vietnam War and domestic programs, printing more dollars than its gold reserves could realistically back at the fixed $35 an ounce rate. Foreign governments, particularly France under President Charles de Gaulle, grew increasingly skeptical of American fiscal discipline and began actually redeeming their dollar reserves for physical gold, draining U.S. gold stockpiles. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and announced what has since become known as the Nixon shock. Among a package of economic measures, Nixon unilaterally suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold, ending the Bretton Woods system in a single decision made largely without international consultation. The gold window, as it was called, closed for good. By 1973, the world's major currencies had moved to floating exchange rates, no longer tied to gold at all. For the first time in roughly 5,000 years since gold coins first appeared in Lydia, the global monetary system was completely severed from the physical metal. This is arguably the single most significant rupture in gold's entire biography. For millennia, whether a sacred ornament, imperial coinage, or vault-backed currency, gold had been directly, tangibly linked to money's value. After 1971, money became almost entirely a matter of collective trust in governments and central banks, rather than trust in a scarce yellow metal locked in a basement. And yet, and this is the strange twist, gold didn't disappear from finance. It arguably became more interesting, transforming from currency's backbone into something closer to a hedge, a safety net, an insurance policy against the very paper money that had replaced it. Today, gold occupies a strange dual identity. It's no longer directly used as everyday currency anywhere in the world, yet central banks still hold enormous gold reserves as a store of value and a hedge against currency instability. The United States alone holds well over 8,000 metric tons, much of it still in Fort Knox and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's vault beneath Manhattan, alongside major holders like Germany, Italy, and increasingly in recent years, countries like China and Russia expanding their reserves as a hedge against dollar dependence. Global gold mining today produces roughly 3,000 to 3,500 metric tons annually, led by countries including China, Australia, and Russia. But the industry carries serious modern controversies. Artisanal and small-scale mining, which supplies a meaningful share of the world's gold, frequently relies on mercury amalgamation, a cheap but highly toxic extraction method that has poisoned rivers and mining communities across parts of South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. In parts of the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, gold mining has been directly linked to funding armed conflict, part of what's often referred to as conflict minerals, prompting regulations like the Dodd-Frank Act's Section 1502 in the United States, which requires companies to disclose conflict mineral sourcing. Meanwhile, large-scale industrial mining continues to raise concerns over cyanide contamination, water usage, and the displacement of local communities near major mines from Nevada to Papua New Guinea. On the demand side, gold's role has diversified even further. Jewelry remains the largest single use of gold worldwide, with India and China together accounting for a massive share of global consumer demand, deeply tied to cultural traditions, weddings, and festivals. Investment demand has grown substantially too, especially following the 2004 launch of gold-backed exchange-traded funds like the SPDR Gold Shares, which allowed ordinary investors to hold gold exposure without owning physical bars. And gold has found genuinely modern industrial uses as well. Its excellent conductivity and corrosion resistance make it valuable in electronics, aerospace components, and even in the visors of astronaut spacesuits, which use a thin gold coating to reflect solar radiation. The metal that once decorated pharaohs now also protects astronauts orbiting the Earth. So why does any of this still matter? Why, in a world of instant digital payments, cryptocurrency, and floating currencies backed by nothing but government promise, does gold still sit in vaults beneath New York and London, still get bought by nervous investors every time markets wobble, still get poured into jewelry at weddings from Mumbai to Lagos? Go back to that opening paradox. Gold does almost nothing. It can't feed you, fuel you, or build you a house. And yet nearly every human civilization that has ever encountered it independently arrived at the same conclusion. This thing is valuable, not because of what it does, but because of what it represents: permanence, scarcity, and a kind of stability that paper, and now pixels, have never quite managed to replicate. Every civilization we've walked through in this story, the tomb builders of Varna, the coin makers of Lydia, the empire of Mansa Musa, the conquistadors, the 49ers, the architects of Bretton Woods, all of them were in their own way chasing the same thing: a way to make value feel real and lasting in a world that constantly threatens to take everything away. Gold's biography isn't really the story of a metal. It's the story of human beings trying to solve an impossible problem. How do you trust a stranger enough to trade with them? And landing again and again across cultures that never spoke to each other on the exact same shining answer. That's the paradox at the heart of this whole story. The most useless metal on Earth became humanity's most enduring idea. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history hiding behind something we usually take for granted, consider subscribing. There's a lot more of these biographies coming. And I want to know what you think. In a world moving toward digital currency, does gold still deserve its place at the center of the financial system, or is its 5,000-year reign finally coming to an end? Drop your take in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.